I'm Neil Acharya.
And I am Nathan Sager.
Welcome to SportsLit. Today on the program, journalist and author Dan Good. We'll be conversing about his first official book, Playing Through the Pain, Ken Caminiti and the Steroids Confession That Changed Baseball Forever. It was released by Abrams Press on May 31st, 2022.
Ken Caminiti was the first Major League Baseball player to say on the record that he had used anabolic steroids to support his performance during the 1990s. Dan Good, our guest today, describes that Sports Illustrated cover from 2002 that amplified Caminiti's confession as a live bomb with a burning wick. Now, Caminiti had the status to be there and say, I did it, and a lot of other guys did it, and here's why. Because just a half decade or so earlier, he had been a unanimous winner of a League Most Valuable Player award, pairing home run power with some of the smoothest fielding play at third base that many fans had seen in a good while. And he was loved by baseball fans, including our guest today, Dan. He played baseball the way fans think they would play baseball. You know, maybe recent example from our experience was think Josh Donaldson when he came to the Toronto Blue Jays in the mid 2010s and just gave them a jolt of je m'en fous, throwing a little Quebec slang at y'all, that the team hadn't had since Joe Carter touched them all in 1993, which we've probably referenced on this program once or twice, Neil.
Absolutely, including our most recent episode, Season 6, Episode 5, with Howard Bryant and Ricky Henderson, who was the guy that set that inning up, the bottom of the ninth in Game 6 against the Phillies in 1993 for Joe Carter's heroics. Back to Caminiti. Sorry, go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, just to throw in quickly, Ricky Henderson was a teammate of Ken Caminiti during that MVP season. Of course, I think everyone played with Ricky Henderson at some point. Go on.
1996, yes. So Caminiti. If there was ever a player who had the talent but perhaps a broken down body due to his playing style and playing conditions, namely the Houston Astrodome, which was his home field, and that, or should I say home turf, I don't think that's the right term, more like home concrete. It was the guy they called Cammy, who played from 1987 to 2001. With steroids, he can maintain and perhaps elevate his natural talent, and I think that part, natural talent, is very important when discussing Ken Caminiti. Steroids didn't give him all those great tools. He was born with that. So, further on, he was known for going full bore all the time, on the field and off of it. He played what you can call full contact baseball, and he was good, very good. But as you say, Nate, that is kind of overshadowed by the confession in a lot of ways. Or at least Dan Good reminds us of that in this book. Because the confession verified years of whispers, years of what... It solidified what we already knew, that the game was full of juice.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember what it did for how it affected baseball. Because, 90% of the sport is hand-eye coordination. And there isn't yet a drug that can give you magic hand-eye coordination, apart from maybe that one WKRP episode with Johnny Fever doing the reflex test. But the way Ken Caminiti had played the game before he made that crucial, career and life choice, that was what drew Dan Good to him as a potential subject. He remembered the way Ken Caminiti played, even though I believe Dan Good grew up in the northeastern United States in Pennsylvania, and Ken Caminiti was playing on the other side of the country for teams in Texas and Southern California. And that was why when he, became a media worker, became a journalist, he decided, let's not forget the effect that this guy had on the people he played with and on his sport by, unburdening himself. And that's why he's written, what I think is an excellent baseball biography. Obviously, us dedicating episode to it is kind of our endorsement. Ken Caminiti, in a certain tragic way, was right on time to get caught up in the steroid era in baseball. Now, I will always point out the commissioner from that era, Bud Selig, got into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. So did Tony La Russa, who managed Jose Canseco and Mark McGwire, whose steroid use had so much notoriety that it became fodder for a Lonely Island comedy special. But, who's not in the Hall of Fame, of course? The best batter and pitcher of the last 75 years, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, respectively. And without them, they're really the story of baseball over the last 35 years is incomplete. But, that's neither here nor there, because we're talking about someone and the toll that being caught up on that took on this person.
Yeah, and Nate, there's lots of talk in this, or lots in this book about, cheating has been around for a long time, even before steroids or different versions of what may be performance enhancing drugs in baseball. So that's there. But what I think most people will feel, and the public sentiment is the guys you just mentioned, McGwire, Canseco, Clemens, and Bonds, that they're cheaters, and it's right that they don't enter Cooperstown. But moving on to touch on what you said as well, Dan Good's book shows us empathy in this tragic figure who is Ken. Someone, and he's the guy you can root for. Someone who, unlike those names I just mentioned, it doesn't seem to be all about him. It's more about why a guy like him, all heart, decided to go down this road.
Yeah, and I think there probably was an aspect of he was doing it because he wanted to be there for his teammates. He wanted to be a good player to help his team. Now, the reason I say he was right on time was, Ken was born in 1963. He was the same age as Mark McGwire. In fact, they both played their last Major League Baseball game on the same day. He was also that year younger than Roger Clemens, 1 year older than Bonds. And as you mentioned, Neil, he came up when baseball still had, the concrete donut type of stadium, especially in the National League. He was probably playing more than half his games on AstroTurf, diving one way to, keep a ball from going down in the left field corner, diving another way to turn a single into a 5-4-3 double play. And it's something that's universal in baseball is when players, turn 30 years old or so, that's when they start to feel the cumulative effects from playing a sport that has a 162 game regular season. People think, baseball players, they don't get tired, it's not physical, but they do it every day for 6 months. And what people said steroids did was, guys, instead of being tired and, worn down in August, they were still as fresh as they were in April. So, like I say, I think everything in life comes down to pressure and permission. If you're a high performance athlete, there's unrelenting pressure to stay at that level because someone is always coming for you to try to take your position. And baseball institutionally did not really get out in front of doping. And in the 80s, I think they were a little bit more focused on trying to, crush the Players Association. They were worried about the cocaine use giving the sport a bad name. So there was the permissiveness piece of it. That confession in Sports Illustrated, of course, came a year after Ken Caminiti was out of baseball. His last game, as I mentioned, was in 2001. And then just 2 years after that, he died at age 41 from the same type of drugs poisoning that also took the lives of comic actors John Belushi and Chris Farley.
Yeah, and he's by far not the only super talented athlete, or as you mentioned, entertainer to die in this manner. He did have a drug problem as well, a substance abuse problem. But as I've heard before, I've covered a player like this for a story I wrote, who was a sensational junior hockey player who succumbed to some of the same things that Ken did. And I heard from one of his teammates. He said, "Listen, if he was just another player, we wouldn't be talking about him, right? We're talking about how talented this guy is, and he wasn't just another player. He was a very good player with his bat in third base. You mentioned that, but I think for the second consecutive episode, it's good to let our listeners know just how good he was. So I'll ask you to, first of all, I'll say WAR, what is it good for? But please tell tell the average fan out there what WAR is if they don't know, and then how it applies to Ken.
Yeah, well, baseball analytics, there's a stat called WAR, wins above replacement, that tries to approximate the value of a player's contributions to his team. And it's, I don't even know how it's calculated. And I think I said in the last episode, Baseball Reference has one way of doing it. Fangraphs has another way of doing it. Someone else probably has another way of doing it. But in that MVP year in 1996, Ken Caminiti, by pretty much all measures, was the best third baseman in baseball. And that's at a time when Jim Thome, who hit over 600 home runs, was playing third base. That's at a time when Chipper Jones, who's now a Hall of Famer, is coming into his own. That year, Ken Caminiti had the numbers and the narrative to be the unanimous MVP of the National League, because like I say, he's playing that acrobatic third base. He's hitting 40 home runs as the cleanup batter, knocking in, Ricky Henderson and Tony Gwynn on the regular, and he's helping revitalize the Padres franchise, that leading them to the playoffs for just the second time in their history. All of a sudden there's a little new enthusiasm around the team. So like I say, numbers and narrative, and it's, wild, Neil. He was a unanimous MVP that year when he was finally able to, not have to dive on the turf in Houston and, getting the pitches in the right role. But it's funny, unanimous MVP that year, never got an MVP vote in any other season. There's actually a great video on YouTube saying he might be the most bizarre MVP winner because of that anomaly. But obviously, clearly he could play when he got into the right situation, and obviously had a little bit of a chemical enhancement. But people, still, because of, the way he played and because of the tragic circumstances that cut his life short, he's still, very well remembered, especially because he helped, the Padres, who had been a downtrodden team for a lot of years, suddenly become relevant and get into a World Series, and, probably, made that helped that franchise sustain itself in San Diego, because they were able to get a new ballpark and so on and so forth.
Well, I think you nailed it a little earlier too when you said, he's the guy that people think they'd play like if they made the majors. He was relatable, and he was, from reading this, don't want to say he's perfect, because I'm sure, his wife Nancy, there was some infidelity there, and definitely not perfect. But as a person, he was the type of guy that would buy the rookie a suit or two. The guy that had no money, coming up, make him look good, or he'd keep a rookie out of trouble, and that was the type of trouble he was often getting into on his own, quietly. In essence, he was harming himself, and that was with illegal drugs, alcohol, and hanging around enablers and later hangers-on. But he was also a favorite of his teammates. And the two teams he played any significant amount of time on, which was Houston, as we mentioned, and San Diego, also mentioned, his teammates generally say he gave it his all, and he had their back, and even their managers' back. In the case of Bruce Bochy, who in 1996, that NL MVP year, he was called out by pitcher Tim Worrell, who he had moved to the bullpen from the starting lineup. Worrell called him out in the paper, and Caminiti read it, and the next day Worrell showed up into I'm going to say was it Jack Murphy or Qualcomm Stadium? Not sure, but regardless what it was named at the time, Worrell's contents of his locker were dumped in front of Bruce Bochy's office, and he turned around and he heard, "I guess you're the manager now, so you should get dressed in the manager's room." And that was Ken sticking up for his manager. Ken came from a baseball family. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in southern San Jose called Cambrian Park. I looked at Google Maps earlier. It seems to be just a little south of that, but as Dan's narrative says, Cambrian Park. And that was a much different San Jose than the sprawling tech hub it is now. His dad, Leroy, was a standout pitcher and catcher in high school in Illinois from the late 40s to 1950. His brother, Glenn, could play too. He always took Ken under his wing. Now, Ken went to high school, as you say, Nate, I believe it would be the 70s, perhaps going into the early 80s, and there was drugs around and drinking. I think it's the same as when we went to high school, and probably the same as high schools are now anywhere. But, Ken could dabble and manage it, even if he went hard, but later that completely unraveled. as it often does for people with addiction issues. And like I said earlier, his career lasted, in spite of all that, 15 seasons from 1987 to 2001. 3 years later, he died 4 kilometers from where he played the 1998 World Series against the Yankees as a member of those Padres. And yeah, I mean, there's more on those that note of drugs, right, Nate?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, like, I think there's a bunch of things that have definitely changed, are much different in 2022 than they were during Ken Caminiti's lifespan. Certainly, I think young people now, there's a much different attitude about young people drinking. I don't think it happens as much anymore. There's definitely a different attitude about how we should, you know, approach it with people who are drug dependent. You know, you're seeing more open mindedness in North America towards the ideas of decriminalizing, you know, minor drugs possession. I mean, you're starting to see like municipal politicians, like city councilors in the city where I live, who 10 years ago they would have been like hard no to the idea of decriminalizing minor drugs possession, and the way that they do in, you know, many European countries. And now they're saying, no, this is a good idea, that we shouldn't be locking people up who have a dependency. And there's also obviously the attitudes toward mental health. Ken Caminiti did struggle, you know, with mood disorders, and there's that different conversation around that. So, but when he was playing baseball, like and being part of the steroid era, that was all, you know, probably of a piece with sort of the government-led, you know, war on drugs in the U.S. and in Canada too, and that's kind of gone by the wayside a little within the last couple of decades. So you can only wonder how things might have played out if he, you know, come along at a different time in North America, and because he's, you know, not here, you can only sort of have someone like Dan Good filling in, you know, trying to figure out, you know, what was going through his mind, and leading him to make certain decisions and affecting, you know, his judgments. And it's through all that and through painstaking work over really, I guess, a decade, as we've heard Dan say, he's produced, I think, you know, an excellent baseball biography of someone who, you know, while not, you know, a Hall of Fame level player, deserves to be remembered for the, you know, way that he affected the sport by, you know, speaking his truth while he still could.
Yeah, and you know what, Nate? I mean, while you're on it, I think you know, it's something I hadn't kind of written down in my notes here too. But I mean, there was you know, going back to his, you know, reasons behind what you know, what happened later in his career with the drug use, you know, substance abuse. I mean, there is we'll talk to Dan more about this, but obviously there was a revelation of sexual abuse that he no one really knew about, right? I mean, I think it came out after the fact. I mean, it might even be the first time we're hearing about it in this book, at least as to the general public, which he endured, I think, as a youngster, which really factored into the way his life turned out, it seemed, at least in the narrative. But back to what you said, it's a sad tale. Dan Good puts a face to Ken and leaves readers. He's not just that confessional guy or that 1996 NL MVP. He puts a face to this guy, Ken Caminiti, and leaves readers with a perspective on his legacy, which, you know, is not really as a cheater, but more so as a good soul who was the first to come clean on what was the dirtiest scandal in North American and probably world sport at the time, one of the biggest ever. I mean, however that gets dissected later, it certainly was, you know, all over the news. And let's find out from Dan Good what that confession, what Ken's confession was worth, and much more about the man, his career, his life, and you know, everything about him, and also about Dan as well. So we'll talk to him right after the break. And yes, we're back on SportsLit, another baseball episode. Nate, very excited about that, 2 in a row. And joining us, as we talked about him off the top, Dan Good. He's in Scarsdale, New York. Nate, go ahead.
Yes, thanks for joining us today, Dan. First thing I wanted to wonder about, how did you find the complexity in your subject, Ken Caminiti? Because you might not have known what you were going to find when you started researching for this book back in 2012.
I had no idea how complex this story would be. I had no idea how deep this story would go, and I had no idea how much I would learn about him. You kind of think when you go into a topic, and I researched Ken for a year, and I was a baseball fan, a big baseball fan, and that's really why I was drawn to his story. But after researching his story for about a year intensely, I just felt like there was more there. But I had no idea what I was going to find. I had no idea where this journey would take me, and really intrigued by the shape of it, the scope of it, and what his life meant.
And looking back now from the viewpoint of 20 years later, what value did his admission in Sports Illustrated have in 2002?
His admission was massive because up until that point, we really didn't have a credible figure, a baseball player coming forward and admitting to steroid use. Jose Canseco, right around the same time that Ken came forward for Sports Illustrated, did an interview with Jim Rome and talked about how 85% of players are using. And you start doing the math in your head and you're like, okay, that's what, 21 players in each team? Like, that's a really big deal. Who's talking about this? Who's coming forward? For this MVP to come forward and say, I use these things, I did them, they helped me win all these awards, I don't regret them. That was massive. And it really changed the scope of the conversation. And it forced baseball's hand because now Washington, D.C. is looking in. Now fans are criticizing this. We're really wondering what we watched. Is this legitimate? Is this real? And it really forced baseball to start having to clean up its act.
Yeah, but at the same time, this book really puts it in the terms of the decisions a working pro athlete has to make. And a good friend of mine always says that everything in life sort of comes down to pressure and permission. In this case, it's pressure to perform. Maybe it's permission to do certain things. Why do you think that Ken was someone who was willing to, take that step? Or is perhaps the point of the book, perhaps that anyone in his position as a ball player in his early 30s with a shoulder problem would have done it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I like the way you phrased it. I do think that this was a situation that every player of that era had to confront for themselves. All the power to the players who said, this isn't for me, I don't want to use these things, I want to play clean. But you look at Ken's case, and you look at all the substances that he was taking on and off the field, looking at painkillers, looking at amphetamines. What's that next step? Where is that boundary crossed that this is now cheating and bad, but the other things are, obviously the drugs he was using off the field were bad, but it's a really fine line, and it's a really complicated thing because even when you go back and look at all of the media coverage back then from the 90s, creatine was big. These players are taking better care of themselves. This is packaged in a positive way, and now you look back and say, oh, they were actually using steroids and not creatine, at least some of them. But there's a really fine line between one and the other. And I think that ultimately for Ken, this was something he looked at earlier in his career and said, this isn't really for me. This isn't something I have to do. And by 95 and 96, he's on the backside of 30. He wants to get that next contract. He wants to be set for the rest of his life and provide for his family and help his team win. And he felt like he couldn't do that by, being on the DL, not playing. And he felt like taking that chance, taking that risk, moving in that direction, was the right decision for him at that time. And it's even complicated looking at usage because there were players, and Ken was one of them, who used these things the right way, at least at the onset. And if you cycle on and off properly, I'm not, advocating for steroid use, but, there's proper usage to this. And then there's improper usage. And he was somebody who always took things to the extreme. So, it's always one of those things where it all became too much for him. But I think in the early stages of that, it was a really natural decision. It was just something that he realized, I want to be the best player I can be for myself and for my team. And I'm going to, take this journey and take this path.
Not to make this entire. Sorry, Nate. Did you have something to say?
No, go ahead. No, go.
Yeah, not to make the entire episode or talk about Ken, specifically about steroids, but it is a massive part. I mean, it's in the title of the book. So I wanted to ask you, the casual fan, casual sports observer who watches all sports, would you say? I mean, for me, it really appeared that performance enhancing drugs really took off after the 1994 labor stoppage. And if we're looking at a timeline, that's the beginning, quote unquote beginning. I'll use that a little bit loosely. And then it culminates in these congressional hearings after Ken's confession. Do you agree with this chronology?
I think that's pretty fair. There was some steroid use prior to 1994, prior to the strike. In the 80s and the 70s, there were some players here and there using. Jose Canseco is the most visible example of that. But, it was kind of scattered throughout the league. It wasn't something as in your face as it was in the 90s. And when the strike happened, the players couldn't work out at their team facilities. They couldn't work out with team personnel. And this really drove them to find their own people, find high school friends, find gym people. And this really drove that whole workout element underground. And that's really where this surfaced from. This was something that these players are, pursuing their own fitness routines. They're working with other people. And this infiltrating the game with this weightlifting element really proliferated the problems of steroids and really made it more common and prevalent.
And why do you think, I know this may sound like a really basic question, but why was there a need for a congressional hearing on this matter at a time when, you got like the Iraq wars going on, you got a lot going on in the States. I think it's just post 9/11. Why is there a need for all of this at a federal government level, to happen regarding baseball?
It's a really good question too. I think that, you look at John McCain. John McCain was really cracking down on this. Baseball and steroids were an easy target because of the antitrust situation around baseball. And I just think because it was easy to chastise them. Oh, this is wrong. George W. Bush is talking about performance-enhancing drugs in the State of the Union address. To your point, there were bigger problems in the world than performance-enhancing drugs in sports. But I think it was an easy thing to focus on. And it was good theater. And, they forced these players to show up. Obviously, some of them didn't say anything. Some of them wagged their fingers and denied it and then tested positive later. So it was a really interesting time. But it was I think it was Washington, D.C. looking at baseball and saying, you're not doing enough, so we're going to, make you look bad. We're going to embarrass you.
And also, do you think it would have happened in the same way had the president of the United States not been so vested in baseball, being a former owner of the Texas Rangers? Go ahead.
I think that's part of it too. He was so tied into all of this, on a broader level. But when you look at the people around baseball and what they knew and when they knew it and what they did about it, the president of the United States is somebody who's in that group. He was in ownership at the time when ownership should have been paying better attention of this and was benefiting from people showing up and buying tickets to go watch these steroid, using players hitting a bunch of home runs. So it's a really delicate, weird, strange balance going on there.
And Dan, you hit on something that sort of segues around to what we wanted to ask about the reporting of the book, the fact that, players taking their training away from team facilities was an unintended consequence of the strike. In terms of Dave Moretti, who was Ken Caminiti's childhood friend and sort of, I guess his connection for steroids and how to use them. How did you sort of connect with him, and how did the two of you develop the two-way trust where he trusts you to get the story right and you trust him to be truthful?
I will say that element, that trust, was the most important thing of any of the people I talked to, because I needed to know that he was telling me the truth. And, he's telling me all these things about all these people. And he wasn't really going into detail about players and all that sort of thing. But the things he's telling me, if he's not telling the truth about them, my entire book is questionable, is suspect. And it's really tough because it's not like he has records laying around showing all the players that he gave steroids to. So I really needed to dig and to double check and triple check everything he told me. I first connected with him over Facebook. I had started connecting with some of Ken's friends from high school, and a bunch of them said, hey, you should talk to this Dave. Dave, he knows a lot. He was really close to Ken. So that was one thing. There was a lot of people who were close to Ken saying Dave was really, really close to Ken. So there was that. And he told me, he said, I'm happy to talk if you come out to California I'll tell you everything you need to know. I'm not doing this over the phone. And I said, okay, I'll fly out. So I took some time off from work, flew out to California, met with them. And within an hour of arriving, he's telling me about how he supplied all these players with steroids. And my jaw just on the ground, wasn't expecting the conversation to go in that way. We weren't even on the record at the time. And, kind of worked our way onto the record. And at the same time, I said, okay, this is a crucial source. This is the most important source in the book, let's be honest. But at the same time, I can't just run everything he's telling me as is. There were little pieces, little elements. There was a player who had been connected to a woman who Ken was connected to, and Dave was telling me about this player. And when I interviewed Tom Rich, who has since passed away, who was Ken's agent at the time, he was telling me the story about his player that he represented, who was around the same woman that Ken was. And he said, I'm not going to tell you who it was. And I asked him the name, and he said, that's it. And I said, okay, if there's 1,000 players in Major League Baseball and Dave knows that this is the specific guy involving with this woman, like that's a big thing. The other big thing was Richie Lewis. Richie Lewis, may he rest in peace. I interviewed him a couple years ago, and he actually talked to me about working with Dave. And it was really tough because I can't just go into all these conversations with players saying, hey, do you know this Dave Moretti guy? Did you ever connect with him? Like, they're never going to say yes to that. But I called Richie. He had been friends with Ken in spring training in 1996 with the Padres. And he brought up Dave's name in the conversation. I said, okay, let's see where this goes. And, we were just talking at the time. And I, asked him more about Dave. And he said, I don't want to say anything that makes Dave look bad. But if he's okay with me talking to you about this, I'm happy to do so. So we scheduled a subsequent conversation, and he's telling me, the details of Dave helping him set up his own steroids program. And at the time, Richie was playing in AAA, and he was telling me about how one of his packages got intercepted by the front office staff of the team he was playing for. So I cold called the person who was working at that team at the time. And in a 2, 3, 4 minute conversation, he confirmed every detail that Richie told me over the phone. So that said, okay, like there's 3 different layers of confirmation to this story. And I really had to do that with everything that Dave was telling me. There were little details, little fragments of conversations, and I really had to triple check everything, but everything matched up. And it's interesting because, people can look down on, the things that Dave was doing for players, but I found him to be the most trustworthy person I interviewed in this entire process.
Well, there's that Bob Dylan line, right? To live outside the law, you have to be honest. What was sort of the background that Dave Moretti had that sort of, enabled him to sort of, provide, I guess a working knowledge of how to use anabolic steroids to players?
He had been working in that gym culture for more than a decade. He had been going to college and studying these things. So he was really connected with that culture, and he was really connected with that world and understanding how to do things properly, studying where the drugs were manufactured and how they were made, and making sure they were made in clean facilities, just because a lot of times people who don't know any better are buying cheap stuff from overseas, and it's junk, And at a certain point in 1991, in 1993, Ken was really kind of grasping with this, wondering if he wanted to use these things. He was researching things a little bit. He was given a package of steroids by a fellow player at one point. And at the point, he was just like, I don't really want to use this. But then someone else gave him something, and he talked to Dave about it because Dave was knowledgeable. And Dave was like, no, this is junk. But if you want to use this the right way, we can use it the right way. Like, we can do these things the right way, and I can help you. So it was kind of an evolving conversation between the two of them. And, their connection goes back to their brothers playing Little League Baseball together. So it really required trust from Ken to be able to trust somebody being able to do this the right way. And subsequently, when players started connecting with Ken and saying, can you connect me with the person who you're working with? It required trust too, because at any point, this could get out. Dave could get in trouble. Anything could go wrong. Like, you really need somebody at the center of this who's going to be on top of things, who isn't going to keep a paper trail, who's covering their bases. And Dave did all those things.
Yeah, you said it, right? They grew up. They basically grew up together, right? In San Jose.
Yeah, they grew up together.
Okay, aside from performance-enhancing drugs, Ken had substance dependency issues, and he went to rehab. And it's in rehab where this bombshell gets dropped in the middle of the book about this sexual abuse that Ken had suffered as a youngster, and that had led to a lot of things. Speaking as writer, journalist, author, how hard was that to navigate, considering it was a key piece of information and you had kind of a little to go on, and then and to have it be such a big part of the book?
Yeah, it was a really difficult thing for a lot of reasons. I mean, it was emotionally devastating to learn the details. And you're exactly right. I don't have all the details, and I don't know that I ever will. But you start peeling back layers of it. It started when I first interviewed an attorney of Ken's who had worked with him later in his life. And he told me that Ken had endured this childhood trauma, and that was at the center of his addictions. But because of attorney-client privilege, he didn't really go into detail about what had happened. And that really struck me. And then as I started tracking down and talking to people who went to rehab with Ken, they confirmed similar things, that Ken had talked about being sexually abused as a kid, that the details weren't really, he wasn't really forthcoming, I think, even to them at times about full details. It wasn't like he was documenting each thing, but he talked about how much this devastated him, how much this, really, it really burrowed down deep, because, this is something that you don't talk about. This is something you bury and forget about. And, it resurfaced for him. He really tried to kind of turn his mind off. I think a lot of his addiction problems were fueled by that. And without being able to address this properly, it kept coming back and, popping up at the worst times. But it was really difficult to try to report it out because so few people knew about it. Even the people I talked to trying to confirm these things, people very close to Ken, didn't have any details. And he really walled off different aspects of his life to different people, which made it complicated. But, hearing from 3 different people in 2 different rehab centers talking about similar things, it made me, it crossed that threshold for me in terms of being able to report it. I really wish I understood more the context of it and what exactly happened. But, at the same time, it really devastated him. It really crushed him. And I think it was the central trauma, the central tragedy in his life. And I think it impacted everything else that came after it.
You make the really interesting point that it's in rehab where he's first able to speak openly for the first time, and that in turn sets him up to be at ease to discuss steroids publicly. So, Dan, could you kind of explain how the confession came to be out of rehab into the CNNSI expose?
Yeah. He goes to rehab in late 2001, early 2002. And he's taught that the truth will set him free, that he has nothing to hide, that these secrets and problems don't have any hold over him if he can talk about them openly. And, and then he's just trying to live his life and move forward. He got in trouble with the law with this arrest in late 2001 in this Houston hotel room. He was trying to, let everybody know that he was on the right side of things, that he was cleaning up his life. And the CNNSI producer, Jules Bailey, contacts him, says, hey, I'm interested in working on a story, would love to talk to you. And he says, I have nothing to hide, come out to Nevada. He was at a motorcycle rally, motorcycle convention. So she flies out to this motorcycle convention and in this hotel room talks to Ken about his career and talks to him about, greenies and the ups and downs and the struggles he faced and, the emotional issues and steroids. And he admits on camera to her for the first time in an interview that he had used steroids in his career, that he didn't regret it, and really didn't show a lot of remorse, but was really trying to clean up his life and move forward. And at that point, CNNSI was getting ready to shut down. It shut down in May 2002, right around the time that this article was getting ready to come out, this story was getting ready to come out. So they decided that they were going to hold it for Sports Illustrated and publish it in Sports Illustrated. They were going to give this story to Tom Verducci. So Tom Verducci flies out to Texas at Ken's house and talks to him subsequently. So he did his own reporting. He did his own interview with Ken, confirmed a lot of the same details that the CNNSI producer had confirmed earlier, and filled it out with his own reporting. And then this bombshell gets dropped on in late May of 2002, and it was just interesting seeing how his rehab and his desire to be open caused him to be open to the point that he was too open in a way, and admitted this massive thing that so many players and people in baseball were criticizing him for, when all he wanted to do was just clear up his name and move forward with his life.
And I can certainly remember how I would look forward for Sports Illustrated to land in my mailbox on, I guess we'd get it on Friday in Canada. But
Yeah.
Dan, do you have like a specific memory of where you were when you first heard that story or saw that magazine cover?
Not specifically, but I just remember the hugeness of it. I remember that was a big deal. That was a big issue. And I was actually getting ready to graduate high school that week. That was the same week I graduated from high school. And it was just a massive thing. And I just remember the news cycle. It was just on TV, on SportsCenter for days and days, people talking about it. And it was this huge, huge cloud and this big, massive thing. And, you know, at the time, it was just fascinating. It was strange. It was weird. It's, you know, how do you feel about your heroes if they did things you don't like? You know, if they were somehow using substances to be better than they should have been. It's a really complicated issue, and it remains a complicated issue till this day.
In baseball, the word steroids is synonymous with the asterisks, and that is always assigned to home runs, whether it's the home run chase in 1998 for the all-time record to beat Roger Maris, or the all-time record to beat Hank Aaron, which Barry Bonds did. How do we examine Ken's NL MVP season of 1996, knowing he was on steroids, but given there were, you know, there's elements other than power involved in having an MVP season, unlike specifically with the home runs?
It's an interesting thing, and I always go back to this of, okay, if Ken doesn't win the MVP award, does Mike Piazza win? Mike Piazza's faced his own speculation about PED usage. It's a really delicate thing. Barry Bonds actually was the best player that season in the National League. If we were going based on statistics alone, Barry Bonds should have won the MVP. But Ken was the heroic story. Ken was this, you know, he was out of some folk hero. You know, it was folk story. You know, this tearing his rotator cuff, carrying the Padres to the playoffs. The Snickers game when he had food poisoning, gets, you know, 2 liters of IV fluid, you know, chomps down a Snickers bar and then goes and hits 2 home runs. I mean, you know, the plays at third base, the diving stops, throwing the ball across the diamond from his butt. I mean, he was playing at a level that so far beyond anything he had done before or even after that point. He was having a special season. He was really the team leader. He was the engine of that team. And there were so many things going right for him. It was such a good story. And that's what I keep coming back to. That's really why he won. His statistics alone, he didn't lead the league in anything other than sacrifice flies. He tied for the league in sac flies, and that was it. But 40 home runs, 130 ribbies, great batting average, and fantastic defense. So it was just the all-encompassing story. But his story was great that year.
Do you find it interesting though that, you know, that's what came to my mind when I read this book, was like it seems like steroids is connected almost directly to the home runs. You don't really hear it in other elements of the game. I mean, maybe you do, but not in the same way.
No, you don't. I mean, the big focus is home runs. Power pitchers, sometimes, you know, you see the fastball going up 4 miles per hour when they're 35 and saying, something's a little weird here. But otherwise, no. You know, you don't look at batting average. You know, you don't look at batting average and say, oh, they're using steroids to help their batting average. No, it's power. It's pure power. And that's what it always is. And it's interesting, too, because some of that power didn't always help players. You know, you have those middle infielders who would, you know, hit those little bloop singles over the infield, you know, and then they start using steroids. Now they're flying out to the outfield. So it's, you know, it's a complicated thing. And, you know, some players used it to advantage. Some players used it to disadvantage. But it definitely helped Ken in the power category.
It's interesting because me and Nate were talking a lot about like timing and, you know, the bad timing in the case of Ken, or how his timing intersects, you know, pivotal moments that kind of led to where he ended up. And I think of, you know, it's interesting now, this book comes out and we actually have, I read an article today here in the Toronto Sun about, you know, we'll have you know, perhaps the new single season home run record and it'll be done by someone who isn't taking steroids, and it's again, I've just found that to be an interesting timing thing.
This season for Aaron Judge has been so iconic and so special. He's in line for the Triple Crown. He's at that 60 home run mark, which only 7 players have done all time. You look at the fact that he's leading everybody else by 20 home runs. That's a special thing, and that's something that we haven't seen since Babe Ruth. That type of gap between first and second place in home runs across the major leagues. He's playing at a level that we haven't seen before. And I think, as we understand what it felt like with McGwire and Sosa and Bonds, I think that some of the fun, we'll say, has been taken away from it. It's a little bit more sobered, more mature, but at the same time, you look at the fact that it's 20 or 30 years that it takes for somebody to do this. From, Ruth to Maris was 30 plus years, from Maris to McGwire and Sosa was 30 plus years, from Bonds to Judge is 20 plus years. And I think that's an important thing. Like, these seasons don't come around often, and it's really special when they do. And I think it's a chance to just appreciate somebody, achieving greatness, because it doesn't happen very often.
Speaking of greatness, Ken's always been looked at as fielding, I guess, just as much as his hitting, how he played the game and how he played third base. And I know you wrote about that in the book, and I was hoping you could read us a passage so our listeners can kind of, especially those that never really watched him play, they'll know how he did play through your words.
Of course. Yeah, let me read a couple words on that. Playing third base is sort of like being a hockey goalie without the pads, or crossing the street across traffic. It's like wrestling a steer at the rodeo. You have to time your dive perfectly and corral the bastard around the horns. You wind up flat in the dirt, but instead of a 600-pound bovine, you're trying to subdue a white pill, a 115-mile-per-hour blur. And when you get it under control, you have to collect yourself and throw the ball 130 or so feet across the diamond to nab the batter in the 4.3 seconds it takes to run from the batter's box to first base. The hot corner, as it's nicknamed, relies more heavily on instincts than other defensive positions because the players usually position closer to home plate. And since there are more right-handed than left-handed hitters, batters are more likely to hit the ball to the left side of the diamond. Playing third base requires a specific set of skills, and few had those skills or played the position better than Ken Caminiti. Watching Ken play third base was like listening to Hendrix wail on the guitar. It was a revelation. He was a master craftsman, an artist, fully submerged in his craft. He did things you didn't expect. Knock a ball down that other players would miss. Gun the ball to first harder than anyone. Give a glare that could melt titanium. You watched him and knew you were witnessing something special. Third base was a reflection of Ken's influences and experiences. He played the position like he had played football, bruising and relentless. He relied on the stuntman's precision from all the jumps off his family's roof into the backyard pool and high dives off a rock at a nearby reservoir in his youth. And then there were the endless ground balls he took, the effort he poured into playing the position. Ken had physical talent, but without putting in the hard work, expertise would have eluded him.
Thank you.
Indeed, yeah. And just to piggyback on that, Dan, what is important to know about the work that Ken Caminiti did, I think, right from his early life to become a major league third baseman and a 15-year player?
He worked so hard to succeed. He worked so hard to get ahead of players. He obviously had a lot of physical talent, and I think he realized that by high school, that he was a little bit better than everybody else, but he had to harness and nurture that, and that meant working really hard, and I think he really learned that drilling mentality from his first year in college. He played junior college ball at San Jose City College, and John Oldham was the coach there, and he just had this, just drilling all the time. And I think getting into that mentality really taught something to Ken about specializing in baseball and specializing on different areas of the game, being great on defense. And he also learned how to switch hit as his college career went on. He wasn't somebody who was doing this as a kid. He had to work at it. He would go to the cage and work on his swings from both sides of the plate every time he could, every chance he could. So it was the physical talent, but if he didn't put in the work, it wouldn't have paid off the same way. He would have just been, that, special kind of college or minor league player that doesn't quite pan out, but he stuck with it. He kept working at it. And it required him to keep working at it because, as he made it to the major leagues, he had some success, but he was inconsistent at the plate. He was still making errors. He was still learning the position. He hadn't quite become that expert, that top tier player yet. And it really took him a little bit of time and a lot of work to get to that point.
And what barriers did he face in his path? Because I'm sort of remembering, well, he played football and he wasn't a huge, big framed guy like Aaron Judge, right? And now also he broke into baseball when the National League is still in the concrete donut era with all those artificial turf parks, and he's playing in Houston, and he's throwing his body all over the place to rob hitters of base hits and extra base hits.
That was a big part of it. I mean, playing in the Astrodome, playing on that concrete turf, that did a lot of damage on his knees and back, and those kind of lingered throughout his career. He had those lingering injuries from his football days, from his college baseball days. That rotator cuff, that shoulder, had been a recurring injury that really became an issue his junior year of college. He had a collision with a college catcher, play at the plate, dislocated his shoulder, and that shoulder continued to bother him. And I think you saw a lot of these football and early career injuries continue to pile up, and he kept playing through them, and he found ways to keep playing on the field. And, I think he was looking at substances to pick him up, substances to take him down, but he saw those substances as being a good teammate, doing what he can, everything he can to be on the field. And there's a reward that comes with that. There's a respect that comes with that, and that's the tough balance, because you respect him for, putting in all that effort and putting his body through hell to play. But then you say, you have to take care of yourself. You really have to make sure you're doing the right things. And there was that balance that he really struggled with.
I wrote a long form piece last summer. It published last summer on a talented hockey player who's succumbed to the effects of drugs and alcohol, just like Ken did. And he was also known for his incredible skill and his big heart, which is one thing that you also illustrate in depth here about Ken, about what a good guy he was, and examples of that. But the one thing I often heard when I talked to former teammates and some opponents was, this is specific to the players, is that they hoped that, whatever I was writing was something his parents could read, or if I'd reached out to his parents. Now, I know you did reach out to the Caminitis and they declined, because you write about that in the book. But with that said, what do you hope his family, his kids, his parents, his brother, his wife, they take away from your empathetic angle on this story?
I think one important thing is that the love that they had for him and the love that they showed for him is reflected. I know it's tough because you look at, the tragic way he died and the way his life went. They really loved him and they really supported him as best they could. And I think that's an important thing. There were so many people who loved him, who adored him, who appreciated him. And I want that to resonate. It's easy to look at the negative qualities and the issues he faced and the struggles he faced. These are common struggles that people face across our entire society, whether they're famous baseball players or just, people who are working down the street who you walk past every day. These are common issues. And, I think I understand why people close to him didn't want to talk to me. I understand why there's that resistance. I understand the sensitivities involved far better than most people do. I just hope that I handled his story with respect and compassion. And I know it's not an easy thing. I know it's not an easy thing to put all these details out there. And the people who are related to him didn't ask to be famous. And that's the really tough balance is, Ken is obviously this famous baseball player. His relatives aren't. And that's a really tough thing when you're writing a book like this, to be fair to everybody. I hope I've, done the best I could in being fair to them. I obviously wish I could have talked to them and had more participation from them in terms of the book itself, but I respect the decision that they made not to talk to me, and I wish them all the best.
Now, two of the guys closest to Ken were teammates Jeff Bagwell and Craig Biggio. In fact, they vouched for him, as you write about, in his second stint with the Astros. Yeah. He played a long time with both of them. So when you were writing this book, it's a 10-year process, you say, to write this book. And Jeff Bagwell reveals during the pandemic in 2020 that he is suffering from alcoholism, and that's when you're finalizing this book. So did that change, like when you heard about that, did that how'd that change the narrative, or was there a moment where you said, hey, maybe I need to look at this in a different way now? Or
yeah, that was one of those things. I wish I had more time because it did come out right when I was writing the book. I really I sympathize for him, and I think a lot of the players I talk to are dealing with these similar problems. Obviously maybe not outwardly the same way that Jeff has been or the way that Ken did. But there's such a difficult thing with seeing your career end, and your whole identity is centered around playing in front of 40,000 a night, hearing the cheering crowd, being famous, signing autographs, being somebody that people care about. And then your career's over and you don't have the camaraderie of the clubhouse anymore. You don't have the cohesive thread in your life. I think Ken really struggled with that, and a lot of players did. And my heart goes out to Jeff and other players who have faced those issues. I think that it's a lot more common than we as the public know and recognize. You hear these little reports here and there, and someone might come forward and talk about it. I think these are bigger issues that happen a lot more commonly than we think they do. And I think it's a really tough thing for a lot of these players to step aside. And but no, Jeff and Craig were great friends to Ken, and the three of them were really close. Yeah,
and it did seem that Ken's, just the little amount that's out there about it seemed like Jeff Bagwell's problems maybe did, like you alluded to, happen after baseball ended, whereas Ken's issues seemed to be while he was playing, even though he could still play pretty well for most of those 15 seasons.
That's my guess. I'm not exactly 100%, but that's my guess. Because as you look at Ken's situation and the role that Jeff played with Ken in trying to help him and mentor him, even as a younger player, I think that says a lot. And I think that really resonated throughout his time with the Astros. It's tough to say when things began, but I think, definitely with your career ending, it's a common theme and it's a common thread for a lot of these players.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Jeff Bagwell in the Hall of Fame. So is Craig Biggio. I noted that when we were researching this, Dan, that Ken is in a couple of sort of local halls of fame. The San Diego Padres have put them in theirs. His hometown of San Jose has them in their Sports Hall of Fame. How valuable is it that there is that that people have put that respect on his name and on his game and who he was as a person, and said, hey, this no matter what, this guy had an incredible sporting life.
I'm really proud that those entities had celebrated him and appreciated him and put them in their halls of fame, because he deserves to be there. He was one of the iconic players in Padres history. That new stadium, that new ballpark doesn't maybe get built without him, without his input, without him getting that MVP season, without showing that team a way to win and giving that city a team to support and to adore and love. And he was that engine with San Jose. Like he belongs there. He belonged there 15 years ago. I was really glad to see that he's being honored in that way. It's important to celebrate and remember him. Obviously he struggled in a really difficult way, and his life ended in a way that no one would have hoped for. But that doesn't negate the person he was. It doesn't negate the player he was. He was the MVP award winner. He was a 3-time All-Star. He should have won a lot more Gold Gloves than he did. And he was a heck of a good guy for a lot of people. And I just think it's important that people remember that. It's not fair to just cast him aside just because. What if he doesn't come forward? If he never comes forward, we don't know. We can guess. We can assume he did, but we never know for sure. He's the one who came forward to talk about this stuff, and I think that means something.
Now, in terms of getting his story out there, obviously, I've seen your some of the stories that have been written about this book and interviews with you in San Diego, and I'm sure Houston. There's a lot of interest. What is where have you seen a lot of interest? Maybe that you didn't realize there'd be interest in for the story in doing press, because I believe May 31st it was released, correct?
Yeah, it's been interesting. There was obviously those focuses with San Diego and Houston, but it's been generally a national thing. I've talked to, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, did some local coverage in my hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So it's just been Florida. As a player of his stature, he touched fans across the country, and it's been interesting to see how people have responded. But, there's always those little pockets and say, oh, he played minor league ball here in 1985. And, here's where he played spring training and, these little wrinkles to it. But, he has fans and supporters across the country, and it's been neat to connect with them and to see that.
As we kind of wrap up here, Dan, we appreciate how much time you're giving us. This is the first book under your name after years of ghostwriting. So how is that different contractually? If you're talking to other writers across the room, how does that work when your name is finally on the cover versus when you're basically writing ghostwriting or using a pen name?
It's an interesting process, and there are differences. So when it's your book and you are pursuing that traditional book deal, you will work through the publisher. You and the publisher and your agent will work together and hammer out a deal. And, you're sending in the manuscript at a certain point. They're sending edits back. All the approvals go through. It gets published. And it just really, you're working through the publisher with the publisher the entire time. And as a ghostwriter, it's different because a lot of times, and I've worked with some traditionally published books as a ghostwriter, the author you're working with will be the one, and their agent will be the ones who are working with the publisher. You're kind of getting everything secondhand. Sometimes you're brought into the process, but, you're more of just an add-on. You're helping to bring the book together. You're helping with edits, all those sorts of things. You're facilitating. But then the book comes out and you don't do anything with it, by and large, unless you're like the top tier ghostwriter and you get to, go on a tour with the subject that you worked with, which does happen. But generally, the book comes out, they will do publicity. The author or the person you worked with will do publicity. You are on to the next project. You are deep in some other project by then. And, it's been a year since you even thought about this book, and now it's coming out. So it's a different process to be front and center as opposed to I helped write the book and now I'm on to another book.
And in terms of Ken's story, what was the sell an easy one, or was it a tough sell to get people, a publisher to buy into this?
It was not as hard as I thought, but there were some resistances and walls put up early on. I had a little nibble because really what happens is you put together a book proposal, which is a roadmap for the entire book. Here's the outline. Here's the marketing plan. Here's comparable titles and all these sorts of things, who I am, all these things. And you shop this around to agents, literary agents. And, I had a lot of them say, oh, I wish Ken was still alive because, you can't do events and have him sign autographs. So that's one thing. It diminishes the marketing opportunity. Or I don't really work with books in this space anymore. The sports book market has narrowed down. I think a decade ago, this book would have gotten picked up by a Big Five publisher. I'm not disappointed it didn't, but there's a balance there. So, it was really kind of, 3 months of frustration of not getting a lot of nibbles back of, this is really interesting, but not for me. And then I reached out to an agent named Joe Perry, same as the Aerosmith musician. And, he emailed me back that day and said, let's talk, I'm interested. He grew up in baseball in the 90s, just like I did. He had the same mentality and approach that I did to the project. He was on board with it. He helped me punch up my proposal. And subsequently from that, I was connected. We were trying to shop it around and, got some interest here and there, but nothing that was really too exciting. And I had a connection at Abrams, author Michael Stahl, who wrote the Bartolo Colon book. And he helped connect me with the editor there. And from there, it just all fell into place. And it was interesting because, it's like March 2020, pandemic's just beginning, and we're having this conversation about the book and the potential for it. And, finally got the deal in place, and it just kind of went pretty quickly from there. But then it was like, oh no, I have to actually write this thing now because, I'd written pieces of it, but not the whole thing. So now it's like, oh, I have to really commit to this, which was helpful in a way because on a book like this, you could spend your entire life, focusing on every single little piece, every single thing. Yeah, and ultimately you just have to write it. You have to just sit down and write it and get the words out there and make it right. And having the deal in place really helped to light the fire for me and say, all right, I have to write this. I have to make this right. And it just kind of came together from there.
Yes, sorry, Nate. And we saw the results. Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, and Dan, I was just wondering, like, what other authors baseball writing maybe, provided maybe a beacon or an example that just motivated you to keep at this?
Oh, there's so many. One of the ones I befriended and I really appreciate is Dave Jordan. He co-wrote the book with Dave Parker, and they came out last year, Cobra, which is fantastic. And, it's been really great to connect with him. Peter Golenbeck's another one. He's written so many amazing books, the Bobby Valentine book, and so many others. Jane Levy. There's so many great baseball writers, and it's just an honor to be able to publish a book and see my book on the same bookshelf as their books. And, I think there's that imposter syndrome for anybody who says, do I really belong? And you see your book there and you're like, well, there's a book. I actually wrote that, and it's a really special thing. But there's so many baseball writers who have inspired me and inspired me to be better, because I'll read something. Lonnie Wheeler's another one. I mean, there's so many that inspired me to be better with my book and to strive to bigger things, because there's so many books out there that aren't worth reading. And, and I don't mean that to denigrate anybody, but, it's really tough to get it right and to do it the right way. And that's one of the things that I think scared me and kept me working at it for so long, because I knew it wasn't ready. I didn't want to rush it and put something out that I wasn't proud of and that it wasn't 100% there.
Do you think you can ever go back to using a pen name or being a ghostwriter?
I mean, I still ghostwrite. I have a number of ghostwriting projects I'm working on now. There's more interest in having me be a co-writer, have my name on the cover than there was before. Like, I can, help them sell books. I have connections, which is great. So that's exciting. But, I still appreciate it, because it's being able to walk in somebody else's shoes. It's telling interesting stories. It pays pretty well. The projects usually don't take quite as long as a big book project that you're doing on your own. So it's a good balance. I obviously want to write other books of my own as well, but I do like ghostwriting, and I appreciate the chance to learn new things and connect with interesting people.
Well, what's your next project under Dan Good, or is there one?
There will be. I'm still kicking it around. I have some feelers out. There's one or two projects I'm excited about. I really am interested in this steroids era, late 90s, early 2000s baseball. That just speaks to me. It's my era. I think we all have these feelings that our era is the best era, or that it's interesting, but it's really like digging deeper and finding those new angles and approaches that haven't been written before. So I'm still kicking around exactly what that next book is going to be. But once I settle on it, once I feel that spark inside, I know it's going to be there.
Well, you make sure you let us know, Dan. Thank you so much for so much time today, and for this great book that we both read and really got a lot out of. I know you did as well, Nate. So, so thank you again for your time.
Of course. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.